I've been cleaning this building for 30 years. I see things. I hear things. And I remember everything.
Otis Langston's day began in silence, as it always did. The glass doors of Kincaid Low whispered shut behind him at 6:02 p.m., right on schedule. The office emptied like clockwork, lawyers rushing to rooftop parties, clients descending into black cars, interns running on caffeine and fear. Otis, mop in hand, stepped into a world they no longer noticed. His janitor's cart squeaked across the gleaming marble floor, every sound exaggerated in the hush of after hours. He moved with a deliberate grace, slow but certain. His left leg dragged faintly, a legacy of factory work gone wrong when he was just 28. That limp had never left, but neither had his mind. He started in the East Wing, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Conference Room B still smelled like catered shrimp and overcooked ego. Otis bent to pick up a crumpled legal brief left behind on the floor. He skimmed it. The language was sloppy, misquoted precedent. He frowned, then jotted something in his pocket notebook. He never corrected anyone aloud. That wasn't his place. Not yet. Down the hall, the evening lights glowed against glass walls. In her office, Janelle Lowe was still typing, the only partner who stayed after hours. Her eyes were tired but focused. She looked up and saw Otis passing. "Evening, Mr. Langston?" Otis tipped his chin. "Evening, counselor." She smiled. She always used his full name. Never custodian. Never sir, with that forced tone. Just a clean, simple respect. On her bookshelf, Otis had noticed years ago, sat a row of vintage legal volumes, Marshall, Douglas, and Baldwin. She was the only one in that building who might guess what he carried in his pocket. "Take this," she said softly, walking out with a beat-up folder. "Found it cleaning out old files. Thought you might like the read." He nodded, taking it with both hands. "Appreciate that." Back near the elevators, Marcus was arguing with a man in a slick gray suit. "No way that was me, man. The envelope went straight to litigation. I put it in the bin myself," Marcus said, his voice sharp with panic. "Then explain why it ended up on the wrong desk." "Because someone else moved it, I swear." Otis didn't interrupt. He just watched. The man stormed off, muttering about reckless interns. Marcus slumped against the wall. "Otis," he said, voice low. "They're saying I tampered with files. I didn't. I swear on everything." Otis patted his shoulder. "I know. Man, what am I gonna do?" "You're gonna sit tight. And trust me," Otis said quietly. "This place forgets who's watching." Later that night, Otis paused in the central corridor where portraits of firm founders stared down from mahogany frames. Bryce Kincaid's gaze, in particular, had the smug glint of a man who'd never been told no. And right then, as if summoned, Bryce turned the corner, still in his tailored navy suit, sleeves rolled, tie loose. He saw Otis bent over the mop bucket. Something in his eyes curled with disgust. "You again," Bryce muttered. "I don't need surveillance with bleach." Otis stood slowly. "Just cleaning, sir. Someone spilled coffee outside your office." Bryce narrowed his eyes. "That legal brief you were holding earlier. You read it?" Otis hesitated. "Only what was visible." "It's confidential." "Yes, sir." "Understood." Bryce stepped closer. "You know what happens to people who dig into things above their pay grade?" Otis held his gaze, even as the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. "Nothing I ain't already lived through." Bryce scoffed, then turned on his heel. "Stick to floors, Langston." Behind him, Otis slowly reached into his pocket. On a blank sheet, he wrote a single line. "Kincaid v. Denton. Exhibit chain broken. Page 4, Section 2. He didn't say it aloud. Not yet. But one day he would, and the whole room would go silent. By Thursday, the air inside Kincaid Low felt tighter than usual, like the walls themselves knew something ugly was about to unfold. Otis noticed it the moment he clocked in. People weren't talking as much in the elevators. Doors that usually stayed open were now quietly shut. The rhythm of the firm had changed, just slightly, but enough for a man like Otis, who listened more than he spoke, to feel it in his bones. The gossip came in pieces, carried by careless whispers. A client file, high profile, confidential, had been mishandled. The wrong draft was sent to opposing counsel. The firm was furious, embarrassed, and someone had to take the fall. Marcus. By noon, the rumors were no longer whispers. Bryce had summoned a disciplinary committee to review the incident. The hearing would be held the next day, in the firm's large conference hall. A formality, they said. A decision had already been made. Marcus would be fired. Otis stood outside the copy room where Marcus sat on a milk crate, eyes bloodshot, hoodie pulled low over his face. "I swear I triple-checked the envelope," Marcus said. "It had the updated signature page. I put it in the litigation box, just like protocol." "Who signed it out after you?" Otis asked. Marcus shrugged. "They said the log sheet was missing." Otis frowned. "Convenient. I've worked too hard to lose everything over this. They think because I'm young and black and not in a tie, I'm disposable." "You're not," Otis said, voice low. "But they need someone to blame." He took out his notepad, scribbled a name, circled it. "Come to the hearing tomorrow," Marcus said. "They said staff can sit in. I want someone there who believes me." "I'll be there," Otis replied. "And I'll be listening." The next morning, the conference hall buzzed like a courtroom before a verdict. Mahogany paneling, leather chairs, water pitchers sweaty, yang on every table. Bryce Kincaid stood at the head of the long table, flanked by two senior partners. Janelle Lowe sat further down, arms crossed, jaw tight. Marcus sat alone at the edge, wearing his cleanest black button-up, fists curled in his lap. Otis entered quietly, mop handle in one hand, notebook in the other. He lingered near the back wall by the janitor's closet. Invisible. Just how they liked him. Bryce launched in. His voice was steady, smug. "As you're all aware, on July 24th, a confidential draft of the Denton contract was mistakenly disclosed. The envelope had Marcus Green's initials. The document was outdated and improperly handled. This breach, while minor, puts the firm's credibility at risk." Marcus tried to interject. Bryce cut him off. "I've heard enough. There's no chain of custody log because it was never signed out again. He was the last to touch it." Janelle stood abruptly. "With all due respect, we don't know that. We don't even have the logbook to prove it." "We're done here," Bryce said. "You're defending incompetence." Otis cleared his throat. All heads turned. He stepped forward slowly, notebook in hand, mop handle tucked beneath his arm like a soldier's cane. "With even more respect, sir," Otis said, voice gravelly but firm. "You're wrong about that chain of custody." Bryce blinked. "Excuse me?" Otis opened his notebook. "I was mopping the litigation wing Tuesday night, found the missing logbook behind the copier, page torn out, intentionally, but the indentations from the pen, still visible." He held up a sheet with a pencil-shaded impression. The name, K. Cummings, a junior associate under Bryce, time-stamped after Marcus had filed it. "You broke firm protocol, Mr. Kincaid," Otis continued. "Cummings retrieved the file unauthorized, likely on your instruction. That's the real breach." Gasps rippled through the room. "No, sir." L.A. stood taller. One of the senior partners leaned forward, squinting at the paper. Bryce's face flushed. "You expect me to believe a janitor is suddenly an expert in legal protocol?" Otis looked him dead in the eye. "I studied law at Howard. I left in my third year to raise my son after my wife passed. I've been reading every brief you all throw out for 20 years. The silence was thunderous. Otis held his ground. "This isn't about me, it's about Marcus. And the truth." He turned and walked away. His job was done. But the room stayed frozen long after the mop handle tapped against the exit door. Nobody moved. For a moment, the entire room seemed suspended in air, like the breath had been sucked out of the walls. Bryce Kincaid stood motionless at the head of the table, eyes flickering between the pencil-shaded evidence and the stunned expressions around him. Janelle Lowe broke the silence first. She reached across the table, gently slid the notebook page closer and examined it. Her voice, calm but cutting, echoed through the hall. "The shading reveals a signature and a time stamp." She tapped her manicured finger on the name. K. Cummings. Time stamped 4:53 p.m., 32 minutes after Marcus logged the file. The logbook didn't disappear. It was hidden. One of the senior partners, a wiry man with silver eyebrows named Darius McNeil, leaned back slowly in his chair. "Do you realize the gravity of what this implies?" he said. Bryce forced a smirk. "Let's not take the word of a janitor with a notepad. This is circumstantial." "It's more evidence than you provided," Janelle snapped. Bryce's voice rose. panicked now. "You're taking the side of an old man with a mop and a memory?" Janelle stood up. Her chair scraped loudly against the floor. "His name is Otis Langston, and I've seen him cite case law more accurately than half our interns." Then she turned toward the table. "Otis caught what none of us did, while the rest of us were passing billable hours. He was watching, studying, listening, and what he just presented is enough for us to take a serious look at internal misconduct." McNeil rubbed his temples. "Get Cummings in here, now." Someone darted out of the room. Bryce's voice dropped to a hiss. "Janelle, don't be naive. You know what the board values. Optics, stability. If we admit to mishandling this, then maybe we deserve the hit," she said. "You humiliated that boy. You tried to ruin him, and you let your ego risk this firm's reputation." At the back of the room, Marcus sat blinking like he'd forgotten how to breathe. Otis stood just outside the glass doors now, back to the hallway. He didn't watch the fallout. He didn't need to. He'd said what needed saying. But then, the doors swung open. "Mr. Langston," a young woman called after him, "the partners are asking you to stay. They want to thank you." Otis turned slowly. The same mop he'd carried like a cross for decades leaned against his side. He nodded once, quiet. "I'm not looking for thanks," he said. "Just justice." He walked back inside. Cummings had arrived, sweating, trembling, lips dry. He admitted to pulling the file. "Mr. Kincaid told me to. He said he'd handle it, just needed the Denton draft on his desk before 5. Bryce paled. The partners turned on him. "You instructed a junior associate to alter the chain of custody?" McNeil asked slowly, voice hard as stone. Bryce looked around. No one backed him. His voice broke. "I didn't mean, it wasn't supposed to." But the words fell apart. In that moment, everything he built, his fear-based control, his arrogance, his reputation, crumbled under the weight of a janitor's notebook. Janelle stood, calm and clear. "I recommend immediate suspension pending internal review, and an apology, not just to Marcus, but to Mr. Langston as well." Bryce turned to Otis. His face was pale, jaw trembling. "I didn't know," he muttered. "I didn't know who you were." Otis looked him in the eye. "You never asked." Then he turned to Marcus. "You all right, son?" Marcus nodded, tears slipping down his cheek. "You saved my life, man." Otis put a hand on his shoulder. "Just kept the floors clean, including this one." In the hallway, staff had gathered, drawn by the tension. Whispers spread like fire. The janitor exposed Kincaid. He used the law against the lawyer. Otis? That old man's a genius. By the end of the day, everyone knew. By the following Monday, Otis Langston had become something more than a custodian at Kincaid Low. He was a story. A whispered name in the elevator, a half-smile exchanged by paralegals, an unspoken reckoning for every partner who'd ignored him, talked over him, or let their trash scatter without a second glance. His mop cart still sat by the janitor's closet, but now people paused when they passed it. Some nodded, some looked away, ashamed. Janelle found him that morning in the library, where he was quietly reshelving the outdated law books no one touched anymore. "They're offering you a position," she said, arms folded. Otis looked up. His glasses slipped a little down his nose. "What kind of position?" "Ethics compliance, consulting, or something fancy they made up to keep their pride intact," she smirked. "With a nice salary." Otis chuckled. "So they want the old janitor in a suit now?" "They want the man who made Kincaid stutter in front of a boardroom." He shook his head. "That ain't who I am. You're more than what they thought." "I've always been more," Otis said softly. "I just stopped needing them to see it." She sat across from him, leaned forward. "Then what do you want?" He looked out the window, past the skyline of power suits and polished glass. "I want to teach," he said. "Not here. Somewhere smaller, where kids like Marcus are told they matter before the world tells them they don't." She didn't argue. She just nodded. Later that afternoon, Otis cleared out his locker. Inside was the same mop head he'd been using for 15 years, a worn copy of the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure, a photo of his wife, young, radiant, holding their newborn son. He placed everything carefully in a box. As he stepped into the hallway for the last time, Marcus ran to catch up. "You really leaving?" "Yeah." I thought you'd at least take the job. I already had a job, Otis said. One that let me listen to everything y'all missed. Marcus laughed, then bit his lip. So, what now? Otis handed him the notepad. You're gonna apply to law school. First draft of your personal statement better be in that by next week. Marcus stared down at the pages filled with Otis's perfect, handwritten notes. You serious? Otis smiled. Dead serious. They hugged, quiet and firm. 2 months later, the local community college welcomed a new adjunct professor in their paralegal certification program. Professor Otis Langston. No suit, just slacks, suspenders, and a chalk-streaked shirt. He walked into the classroom, dropped his box of books on the desk, and wrote 5 words on the board in looping cursive. Law is for the overlooked. Fall settled in slow and golden, brushing amber across the cracked sidewalks and chain-link fences of the east side. It was here, not among skyscrapers or boardrooms, that Otis Langston found his purpose again. Not in revenge, but in roots. The classroom was modest, plastic chairs, flickering overhead lights, the faint smell of dust and old linoleum. But to Otis, it was sacred ground. His students came from everywhere. A single mother who once filed court papers as a receptionist, a veteran with sharp eyes and a soft voice. A young man with dreads and a record who'd never seen justice done right, and in the front row, Marcus. Yes, Marcus, freshly enrolled Phi, read up. Each day, Otis taught not just the law, but the heart behind it. What's fair ain't always what's legal, he'd say. But we're here to change that. He used real stories, stripped-down truths. Sometimes he'd pause mid-lecture and stare out the window, remembering those gleaming halls and the silence he once held like a shield. But here, he didn't need armor. One Friday, after class, Marcus stayed behind. He leaned against the desk, tossing a worn rubber band between his fingers. I still think about that day, he said. When you stood up in that room, you didn't just speak for me, man. You broke something wide open. Otis nodded. I didn't plan to. But when a lie gets too big, sometimes the truth has to come through the smallest crack. Marcus looked at him. You ever think about going back? To the firm? Otis smiled. Nah. My name's louder out here than it ever was in there. He stood, stretching his bad leg. But I do wonder what Bryce Kincaid sees now when he walks past a janitor. Across the city, in a penthouse office stripped of its former shine, Bryce Kincaid sat behind his desk alone. A new CEO had taken over. The board had forced his resignation after a quiet internal investigation. No press release, just an ending. Sometimes he'd hear the echo of Otis's voice in his head, steady, calm, undeniable. He had tried to write a letter of apology. 6 drafts, none of them right. They all felt empty next to the moment Otis had taken the floor. The moment he froze. Meanwhile, at a community fundraiser hosted by the college, Janelle Lowe took the stage. She had become a key donor for the paralegal program, no spotlight, just steady support. She mentioned a new scholarship launched in a familiar name, the Langston Legacy Fund. For those who were never supposed to get in the room, and for those who will never forget what happened when one man dared to speak. She didn't cry, but many in the audience did. That why. Enter, a boy who'd never believed in his future stood in front of a mirror in a courtroom internship suit, rehearsing his first closing argument. His notepad, Otis's old one, was tucked in his pocket like armor. A quiet revolution was happening. Not in headlines, not on billboards, but in every overlooked hallway, every second chance. And it had begun with a mop, a notebook, and a man who refused to stay silent. The room of young faces looked back at him, wide-eyed, unsure, but ready. He picked up the first textbook and smiled. Let's begin. The man they'd walked past for years had just walked through them all. That was the final chapter, and the story has reached its quiet, powerful resolution. If you'd like a new story based on a different title, or want to explore bonus scenes, character backstories, or even adapt this into a script, just let me know.